So not long after I started working at Cornell in 2013, I had a meeting and walked into an office, and there was a poster of the Arecibo radio telescope on the wall. I'm like, what's that doing there? And the folks said, well, Hal Craft, who works in this office, was instrumental in working at Arecibo. I'm like, you're kidding me, that is so cool. As a kid growing up, in the 70s, I just thought, the Arecibo radio telescope just really captured my imagination. So several years later, a group of us were up at the Antique Wireless Association meeting for Reservoir Museum up north towards Rochester, and they had recently received some panels from the collapsed radio telescope, and so as they were going through, I said, do you guys know that somebody who was really instrumental there is a member of our club? Would you be interested in having him speak? And so last fall, Hal gave a presentation to the AWA, which was just great. And so I asked him if he'd come provide us a version of that presentation tonight. So Hal's been a member of our organization, I'm not sure how long, but I'm really pleased that he's going to do this for us tonight. So this is all yours.
This is what I wanted to talk about tonight, which is the Arecibo radio telescope. And the picture you see is that when it was first built. And I'll describe what's there in a little bit more detail in a minute, but just the core of it is down here, 1,000-foot diameter spherical reflector. The reflector material is hardware cloth, so it's mostly air. So you're looking through the reflector right there. Obviously, it's opaque to the radio waves, but the optical, it's more or less transparent, and so you see a road that runs underneath there. So that mesh is probably supported between 2 and 20 feet above the ground, depending upon the terrain. And up above here is a suspended structure. The triangular structure is fixed. Everything below it moves, so the antenna beam can be moved around. All of it's supported by these 3 towers. And you might ask, why was this built? Who thought about doing this in the first place? And I will say, Ithaca, New York had a lot to do with this observatory. I mean, a lot to do with this observatory. And it all started with a professor at Cornell University, Bill Gordon, who had the idea. I think actually he was reading the tea leaves as to where the money might be at that particular time. But he had the idea that you could, in fact, get radar echoes from free electrons in the ionosphere. And he was thinking out to several Earth radii. Now, Earth radius is, Earth diameter rather, is about, Earth radius is 6,000 kilometers. No, I don't think that went anywhere near that far, but several thousand kilometers anyway. He was hoping also to be able to see some incoming flux from the sun. That was an aspiration that actually didn't happen. But he had this idea that if you had a powerful enough antenna, and you had 1,000-foot diameter and a receiver, you could make those measurements. And as an aside, turns out he miscalculated. He was wrong. He didn't need an 1,000-foot antenna by any means. Before he ever built this, somebody, a former student of his, detected those very echoes using a 100-foot dish in Massachusetts. Nevertheless, and a bit to my surprise, they continued to fund and build this antenna. Now, when he proposed this, he was planning to look straight up at the ionosphere and maybe just a little bit of steerability, a degree or two. But it didn't need full steerability. But when he proposed this and was talking about this at Cornell, the radio astronomers in the astronomy department said, whoa, 1,000-foot dish, we can do a lot of astronomy, radio astronomy and radar astronomy with a dish. But on the other hand, it needs to be steerable. So the thing was put together with these observational techniques in mind. The first was the incoherent backscatter from the ionosphere. That was the fundamental issue that started the whole thing. But then the radio astronomers, and I'm one of those, hopped on the bandwagon. And just the radio astronomy at that time was, and we're talking about in the 60s, early 60s, actually late 50s, was a fairly new research discipline. And what it involved is listening to the natural radio emissions that come from the heavens everywhere. And radar astronomy is fairly straightforward. Radar studies of the moon and the planets and their moons. Now, for radio astronomy, as I say, was a fairly recent discipline. It was discovered really at Bell Labs in 1931 by Carl Jansky, who was trying to understand the noise that he was getting in shortwave radios. They were, at that time, transatlantic communication was by shortwave. And he discovered that there was unexplained noise coming every day. He noticed a critical issue. It came 4 minutes earlier every day. And that's a giveaway. It's not necessarily terrestrial, but it's coming from extraterrestrial sources because that's the way that works. So he was the first to discover the radio noise from the universe, from what was the Milky Way. I think he was probably getting the strong signal from the center of our Milky Way, center of our galaxy called Sagittarius A, which is a black hole that is accreting stuff from around it. And as that stuff screams into the black hole, it emits a lot of radio energy. And I will say as an aside, Bell Labs, by the way, happened to be my first employer when I graduated with a bachelor's degree. Also at Bell Labs, a couple of decades later, there were two guys who were trying to understand noise in a horn receiver system. And they worked and worked and worked and couldn't reduce it below a level that was the equivalent of black body radiation from a body that's heated by about 3 degrees above absolute zero. And this was a mystery, but they figured it out. And what they had discovered was the cosmic microwave background, which is a result of the cool down, redshifted and expanded remnant of the Big Bang that started our universe. For that, they got the Nobel Prize. Was Arnold Penzias and Bob Wilson. So when you're talking about radar astronomy, now suddenly you need to recognize that light travels at a finite speed. And if you're going to make a radar study of, say, Venus, what you will do is typically run a CW signal, fill up the space between Earth and Venus and back to Earth with radio waves, and then shut it off and listen to the incoming waves for however long, and then repeat the process. So the round trip travel time to Venus is 4 minutes. And I've got some examples here, but the one to take a look at is Saturn. Now, if you want to do Saturn, you've got to, the round trip travel time is 2 hours, roughly 2 hours. So you've got to be able to transmit for a little while, and then 2 hours later, be able to receive for a little while. And down below, I've said that the Earth rotates 15 minutes per minute. And if you have 40 degrees steerability from horizon to horizon, horizon is the antenna's horizon, then you've got 2 hours and 40-minute track time. If the object, in this case Saturn, goes directly overhead. I'm not sure this is a reason that the Arecibo telescope was designed with a 20-degree steerability off the vertical, but there is a remarkable coincidence there. And it turns out that what they are able to do radar studies of the moons of Saturn. Saturn and Jupiter themselves are just gas giant planets, so you get no echo from the planet itself, but you do get echoes from the moons. So at the time that Bill Gordon was proposing this, there were these things here that were also going on. Sputnik, there were issues about ICBMs, there were high altitude nuclear tests, all the kinds of stuff that the Department of Defense and the government said, yeah, you know, we really ought to understand what's going on in the Earth's atmosphere. And the result was that the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is now DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, funded building a 1,000-foot diameter, 870-foot radius. This is a spherical reflector with a 20-degree swing from the vertical. And this is in 1959. So what they built was this telescope in Arecibo. You know, this is just to give you an orientation. Arecibo is here, one of the smaller, one of the more major towns in Puerto Rico. At the time I was there as a graduate student, the major industries was the home of Enrico rum and a lot of sugar cane growing around it, and it was a Combalache sugar mill. I'm not sure either one of the, well, I'm sure the sugar mill is no longer there, but I don't know about Enrico, or at least the distillery. And the observatory itself, this is Arecibo, the observatory itself is, I think this is about maybe 15 kilometers as the crow flies south of the town of Arecibo over a very narrow winding road, which is a real adventure. And why in Puerto Rico? Well, there are a lot of reasons. One is that the sun and the moon planets go overhead at some time during the year. It's got relatively stable day-night temperatures and seasonal temperatures. And when you're talking about a huge physical facility, you don't want it expanding and contracting it with the day to night. There happened to be an appropriately sized hole in the ground because this is a karst area where there's just a lot of sinkholes. And the infrastructure was okay, and it's U.S. possession and politically stable. There was a conversation about a potential site in upstate New York, which boggles my mind. That seems like a no-brainer, but nevertheless. So this is what they built. So let me tell you what is here. This is obviously the reflector down here. This triangular structure here is fixed and suspended from the top of these three towers. This tower is due north of the center of the telescope, so it's appropriately called T12. This is T4, T8. These two towers are 260 feet plus or minus tall. This one's another 100 feet taller. The tops are all exactly the same altitude. Down here beneath the triangular structure is a bow-shaped feed arm, which rotates in a horizontal plane. You can see the circle right here. It's got railroad tracks suspended on there, attached there, and the feed arm rotates around. And then down below, you can just barely see it here. There's one here. There's one there. There are two little carriage houses that run on the bottom of the curve shape on the bottom of this feed arm, and they carry the receivers and the feed antennas. This is a helipad that, in my experience, was used only by a helicopter salesman, the governor of Puerto Rico, and an occasional hotshot ex-military people who came by just for the hell of it, basically. And around the corner here is all the support buildings. From the top of the tower, now this triangular structure is supported by four what are bridge strands. These are about four or 4.5 inches in diameter. You can, oops. You can see here the boat-shaped piece. Here's one of the carriage houses. I'm puzzled by this particular image because I don't see the other one, but it's got to be there. And down below here, I should go back. Right here is a catwalk that goes up to the structure from the ground. On the top of that catwalk is a 430 megahertz waveguide. The transmitter is on the ground. And also a cable tray that carries all the cables from this receivers down to the ground, and a walkway. And I will say that that walkway is not for the faint-hearted. It's got wooden planks on the bottom with spaces between them. You can see very clearly. There's chain link fence on the side. You can't possibly fall out, but it is scary. And all the time I was down there, I never was able to get anybody to successfully walk up the catwalk. There was another way to get up there. It's a cable car. The cable car has the advantage that when you get in the cable car and you push the up button in the cable car house, there are no controls in the cable car, so it's going up whether you want to go up with it or not.
It's a one-way trip.
I would say it's really was an experience to go up on there. And when I first went down as a graduate student, I went up every day just to force myself to get used to going up there, but I never really got comfortable monkeying around up there. This is another view from up above. This is the catwalk I was mentioning. Comes down, the feed stuff comes down here into the operations building here. There's an office building here. Down below here are six VSQ, 6 motel type units to handle visitors. There's a kitchen and an eating area down here. And then of course, it's in Puerto Rico, we have a swimming pool.
Cool, yeah.
We were at great pains to point out to the National Science Foundation and Cornell University paid to put in the swimming pool. That was not put in with taxpayer dollars. That's looking at the structure through the reflector material itself, and you can see the open mesh there. I'm a little ahead of myself here, but I wanted to demonstrate here. So the surface is held in place or rests in place on a cable network that's underneath it. And there are heavy cables that run north-south. Here's one here, here's one here, here's one here. And then on top of that heavy cable network, there are lighter cables, and as you can see them here. In order to force since the cables don't naturally fall into spherical shape, to force it, they were tied down to these tie-down blocks that were set on the ground. And it was honestly a fairly tricky job to adjust all of these things so it all fit in, all was in the right shape, because obviously when you pull on this one, you make some adjustments over here as well. So it's an iterative process. That's the catwalk. Before it was perhaps either a cable tray. There's a cable tray, but there's no waveguide up there, and there's no chain link fence along here. All of this stuff came down to the control room. The IF was 30 megahertz, 30 megahertz appeared in that control room. And then there was an array of signal processing gear that was in a rack here. This is, as I recall, was timekeeping and frequency standard stuff. And these things were full of operational amplifiers, time constants, filters, you name it. And at some point over here, it may have been here or here, there was a connection to an analog to digital converter, and then connected to the computer. So CDC, and during my time, CDC 3300 had 3,300 words memory, if you could imagine that. Would be located behind the photographer here, and the transmitter control stuff is also behind the photographer. And to put together an experiment, an individual researcher would connect to the receivers and then use the equipment, whatever equipment, signal processing equipment was appropriate down here. And they were helped by telescope operators, one of which is here. This, I believe, is Angel Vasquez, WP3R, now a very active ham. And by the way, Angel has joined us via Zoom. I happened to I was texting him the other day, mentioned I was going to talk about this today. He said, "Oh, can I listen?" So he's with us today, which means I can no longer make up stuff. And this is, so all of that equipment was at the time was created and maintained by a guy named Sam Harris. Now, if there's anyone here who was active in the 50s and early 60s, the same name Sam Harris may be familiar. There may be one or two of us who were busy then. Was a well-known ham. He was the first ham to do a transcontinental QSO by moon bounce at 1296 megahertz. He was always interested in moon bounce. He was either the editor or a constant contributor or both to the World Above 50 megahertz section in QST years ago. So here he is in charge of now electronics and a knock your socks off moon bounce antenna. So he was living in hog heaven down there. By the way, he was also in his front yard building a smaller replica of Arecibo so he could do, I think it was about 100-foot dish he was building in his front yard to do moon bounce from his home. I will say his wife, who was a lovely lady, was enormously patient. So this was, he was W1FZJ and several other. And as far as moon bounce is concerned, Arecibo, I think, had a number of moon bounce campaigns. And I'm not familiar with all of them. The last one I know about, there may be more of them, and Angel probably was involved in any of them, but Angel Vasquez was involved in the last one I know about, which was in 2010, where they ran it as a sort of a de-expedition moon bounce experience from Arecibo at 432. It was Angel Vasquez, Jim Braycall, who was a former student at Arecibo, now I think a faculty member, maybe retired at Penn State, and Joe Taylor, K1JT, who I'll have something to say about a little bit later on, and two other hams from Puerto Rico. The implications of having an antenna that only can look at a particular object for 2.5 hours at most implies that there may be a whole bunch of experiments, different experiments that go on during a single day, which then implies that there are a lot of scientists down there, which then implies you need to have an opportunity to house them and feed them and so forth, hence the motel units that I mentioned. And then later on, there were built these, what are called the visiting scientist quarters. This one happens to be a 2-bedroom, a 1-bath living room, kitchen unit. There were 2 of these, and there were 4 bachelor units, which were really pretty nice, in addition to the motel units. So we did accommodate lots of visitors from all over the world. And of course, there was a swimming pool. Now, as I think everyone here knows, feeding a spherical reflector is a little tricky. It does not have a singular focus. So this is a little more than you really need to see, but if there's a plane wave that comes straight down this way, the rays that are reflected up and that are near the vertical will gather at what's called a paraxial surface. But if they're further out, come from further out on the reflector, this one happens to be from 500 feet out. That's, in this case, the full width of the antenna. Then the energy passes 96 feet below the paraxial surface. So if you want to catch all the energy from the reflector, you've got to have some sort of collecting element that's, in this case, 96 feet long. And then if you want to move the beam, you just move the paraxial surface up like so. And you can, by looking at that view on the right, you can sense that if you move it out far enough, suddenly you're beginning to collect energy from the ground, which is hot, at least electrically, radiatively hot, and that degrades performance. So you don't necessarily want to go out that far. So folks will do only 700 foot diameter. That's 350 feet.
Oh,
And that would be about need a 40-foot blind feed in order to do that. This is a 96-foot line feed at 430 megahertz. There's a guy down on the bottom for scale. I have no idea what he's doing down there. There are no moving parts down there. This is a circular slotted waveguide, tapered waveguide. And the design is pretty sophisticated, and it's designed in such that everything arrives at the top in phase. Another view of that same feed, plus another one outboard of it. That I think is probably at 1420 megahertz. That's the 40-foot feed that only illuminates 700 feet. I say only 700 feet. That's still the largest filled aperture in the world at that particular time. But radio astronomers like to frequency hop. And this method of feeding the dish is not conducive to frequency hopping. Those line feeds are expensive. They take a long time to build. And by the way, they're really awkward to move around. So the Rube Goldberg way to do this is to say, well, we're going to illuminate a smaller area, maybe 500 or 700 feet. And we're going to feed it with a Yagi array that directs the energy down. It's a compromise. It's not perfect, but it works. And you can see the over here, here's one array here. There's another array over here. These are the edge on to a bunch of 1420 megahertz line feeds. There's another line feed that runs down here. There's an outrigger over here that doesn't have anything on it yet, but certainly does at other times. The same thing. This is these are the 1420 megahertz line feeds, as you see. This one happens to be 318 megahertz and other Yagi. So it's a real kludge. But it worked. So not to get too far into the weeds here, but the early scientific activity was really pretty active. Discover the correct rotation rate of Mercury. This was done by a ham radio operator, by the way, who also was a radar astronomer. Found that the Venus actually turned the wrong way, so to speak. Venus is an interesting target because it has an atmosphere that is dense carbon dioxide entirely. You cannot see the surface. So you have no idea when looking at it, whether it's rotating or which way it's rotating. Radar is the only way to do that. Venus has a industrial grade greenhouse effect, so that the surface of Venus is about at the melting point of lead. It's really not a place to be. So the early maps of Venus was a radar map done of the moon. And then there were passive observations of a whole bunch of celestial denizens, and also the observations of pulsars, which were discovered when I was down there as a graduate student. Turns out that when pulsars were discovered, there were 4 folks down there, including me, who were looking, PhD students looking for a thesis. So the 4 of us hopped on studying pulsars at that time. Some on timing, some on pulse shape, some on dispersion, which I'll describe in a moment. Arecibo was really ideal for those kinds of observations because it had, first of all, it had the biggest antenna, so it had the best signal to noise ratio of any antenna in the world. But we were also accustomed to radar work, so pulse signals were nothing new. And connecting things to a computer was not at all unique. So just a pulsar is a neutron star. It is a collapsed remnant of a star that at the end of its life, a star that weighs more than our sun will collapse in on itself. The gravitational force is so great that it turns all the material into neutrons. It's the size of, it's about the size of Los Angeles, say, with a weight of maybe 1.5 to 2 times the weight of our sun. And it's spinning, in this particular case, at 33 milliseconds per rotation. So it's really humming around there. This is a well-known supernova. Now, there's a star that exploded. The star that exploded is in this plus solar, right? It's right in that area there. And all this stuff is the remnants of the stars, some of the remnants of the star that didn't collapse, it was blown off. And that contains heavier elements, helium, neon, lithium, oxygen, iron, silicon, kinds of stuff that is here. So in case you're wondering where all this stuff came from, this came from an exploding star sometime billions of years in the past, which then collapsed into our solar system, most of which is in the sun, but some of the rocks are floating around like planet Earth. This is somewhat of an aside. This is a picture of a series of pulses from the pulsar, the very first pulsar discovered, CP1919, at 318 megahertz. The full period is about a minute, about a second and a third, 1.313 seconds. You can see how short the pulse is, probably 40 milliseconds. And I did this as a graduate student, and I was looking for correlations from pulse to pulse. So just for the hell of it, I wrote a program that ganged a whole series of pulses up. As you see it, time goes from left to right, and time goes from bottom to top. And I found nothing of interest there. But because I thought it looked pretty, I put it in my thesis anyway. And I was sure my thesis was read by me and my advisor and probably nobody else. So I was really surprised when a few years later, I was stopped in College Town by a colleague, Jim Cordes, who said, "Hey, do you know that this image from your thesis is on an album cover from a rock group in England?" Give me a break. So I went to the record store. These were records in this at that time. It's vinyl at this time. And I found that this was the album cover right here from Joy Division. Album cover, Unknown Pleasures. Not my kind of music. Turns out this became a pop icon. And you can see that's from Amazon. You can buy a t-shirt with that on it. My wife has a piece of jewelry that has that on it. And I've seen pictures of people who have had that tattooed on their back. So I will say that that is my most widely distributed publication in my scientific career. There is no science involved in this whatsoever.
Did you copyright it?
You know, that's an interesting point. No. I mean, it did squat for me. Except eventually somebody figured out who created this. It took a while. And the lady from Jen Christensen from Scientific American finally tracked me down and talked to me about this. So this image has appeared in Scientific American, is on the back page of Scientific American's 150-year anniversary issue. But it's also on a lot of albums. By the way, the band leader committed suicide and the band is gone. So the radar astronomers and radio astronomers were not happy, or were not content with what they had there, and they wanted to upgrade the telescope to a smoother reflector. They wanted easier multi-frequency operation that I was talking about. They wanted a higher power transmitter and a ground screen to reduce the noise when you're at high altitudes, high elevations. This is basically where I came in, the higher power transmitter. I came back to Cornell as an employee in the astronomy department as a project manager for the high power transmitter. The 1 megawatt turned out to be 500 kilowatts because we couldn't afford a megawatt transmitter for the upgraded telescope. So this is what was built. A new reflector. This is the upgrading in 70 to 73. 500 kilowatts, 2380 megahertz. Slightly stabilized upper structure and a new carriage house to hold. Now the transmitter would be in the carriage house, would be up above. And this is a picture of the new surface going on over here and the old surface here. And this gentleman here is Merle Lalonde. If any of you know the Lalonde family, they are from Ithaca. He was one of the original guys who went down to build the place in the first place. He passed away very suddenly. Late 70s. Really particularly good guy. His wife lived here until she passed away. I've lost track of all his kids, but one of them I know still worked at Cornell.
Murray retired.
There were 38,778 of the panels. Not all of them the same shape. There you can see the tie-down cables, the tie-down blocks and cables that are used to force the thing into the right shape. And a great fern garden underneath. That fern garden was not there originally and was not planted. It just turned out that when the panels went on, the environment was such that the ferns really liked it and they just took over. To tune up the surface completely accurately, we did a surveying job. And this is a guy attaching surveying targets, these little white squares here. The surface was connected to the underlying cable structure. Here's a major cable. Here's a lighter cable and a block and a fitting that connected to the panel up above and could be adjusted from below by screwing up. Such as these guys are doing from beneath. So, just to look at that. So it was a surveying job was done. It was done at night with very accurate theodolites around the room of the dish. And we had searchlights that shone down on the dish to, so people could see, so the guys surveying could see what they were doing. Tedious, pretty straightforward. You take the measurement, plug them into a computer, and it tells you how many turns you have to turn this particular screw. As I say, tedious, so what could go wrong? Well, when I found what one thing could go wrong, and that is when I got a call from the head of the FAA in Puerto Rico one morning, and he was relaying a complaint he had gotten from two pilots who were flying airplanes, Cornell, Puerto Rico International Airlines, flew 4-engine airplanes from Mayaguez, which was on the western coast of Puerto Rico, to San Juan, and they would fly close to the observatory. We convinced them not to fly directly over the observatory because the ignition noise raised hell with receivers. And besides, the passengers couldn't see anything once you're right over the thing. So they were not over the telescope. But nevertheless, when they got close to the telescope, suddenly their environment turned yellow, bright yellow. And it scared the bejesus out of them. They gained altitude, lost altitude, turned left, turned right, tried to escape it. They couldn't get out of it until they got past the observatory. And then, so the question from the FAA guys, what were you guys doing? And don't do that again. Well, it was pretty obvious what we were doing. And there's some guys down there who were running the searchlights got bored and decided it would be fun to track that airplane like World War. They followed it across the sky. So it was a new rule for the handling of the searchlights. So this was a new reflector that shiny new reflector, and this also resulted in one of the first complaints I got when I went down there as director. That is the guys, poor guys who were working up here in the daytime found that although this doesn't focus on a single point, nevertheless, it is really hot up here. And what was I going to do about it? One guy complained he was getting sunburned on the inside of his nose. I didn't know he was kidding, but so that was a real problem, which nature has solved. Fortunately, when I got here in the fall, the sun was headed south. It wasn't a problem through the winter. When the sun came back in the spring, nature had corroded the dish enough that there was no longer the bright reflection, and all was happy on the suspended structure. I won't go into details on this. At the dedication of the new system, the new reflector that you just saw, we sent the Arecibo message, which was at 2380 megahertz, 10 bits per second CW frequency shift. This image, which I won't go into, encoded, was sent to a cluster of stars 25,000 light years away. There is an infinitesimally small probability that there will be a response from that. That would come 50,000 years from now. We won't be around. It's not clear who, if anybody, will be around at that time. By the way, you just think back 50,000 years, what was going on 50,000 years ago? 50,000 years ago was when the second or third wave of Homo sapiens, that is us, coming out of Africa and mixing it up with the Neanderthals in Europe. So that was just a stunt, but it was fun, and I will say the reaction to the crowd who was there was amazing. Because of time, I won't go into that. But anyway, this is some of the first radar images of the surface of Venus. There are much better images now. And there began to be careful measurements of what was called a binary pulsar. That is a pulsar that was in an orbit around another neutron star. A high gravity environment. You would expect that the orbit, because of gravitational radiation, would slow down. Joe Taylor and Russ Holtz. Russ was a graduate student, Joe was a faculty member, measured the slowdown, and you can see the error bars are near small enough you can't really see the error bars. And the solid line is what was predicted by general relativity. So it confirmed rather nicely Einstein's theory of relativity in this case. And for this, both Joe and Russ Holtz got a Nobel Prize in 1993. This Joe Taylor is Joe Taylor, K1JT, the very active ham. He's a guy who created FT8, Whisper, FTJ, I think, the digital modes that are really quite popular now, which I don't personally use. So they're still not finished. And one additional upgrade. So a ground screen was added. This is to prevent the radiation from the ground from degrading the noise figure of the receiving system. A Gregorian feed system, and I'll explain that in a moment, with a radon that would take frequencies up to 5 gigahertz now. A megawatt transmitter, because we'll be adding weight, it added support cables. That required some modifications on the suspended structure. And there was a new antenna, heating antenna for the ionosphere group. This is the Gregorian feed. So assume a plane wave is coming down, bouncing off a reflector, a spherical reflector that's below here. It then reflects into this specially shaped reflector, which then does a bounce off of a tertiary reflector, which then reflects it to a single point here. So now you have the spherical reflector, major reflector, having all the energy collected to a single point that's frequency independent. And you can easily now switch receivers, which is really important. So that's what it looked like when it was installed. This is the radome. And a couple of things are fairly obvious when you look at this. One is that it's added a lot of weight. And it's added a lot of windage to the telescope. So I should back up here for just 1 second and say that the upgrading that I just described was really, technically, it was a real success. It worked exactly as they wanted to. There was a lot of science that was done there. Radar studies of more studies of pulsars, studies of fast radio bursts, a lot of studies of asteroids that were radar studies of asteroids, which is an important activity to measure really the position and speed and the likelihood of a big rock hitting Earth. None were found so far that were going to hit Earth, and so forth. But there were also some hits that came to the telescope. There was Hurricane Irene in 2011, with Irma in September of 2017. There was Maria that came in also in September 27. There's 3, I think, Category 5 hurricanes that came by. And then there were just a cluster of earthquakes from December 2019 through January of 2020. Now, when you have a telescope that has a lot of windage, it's not great to have hurricanes. And when you have a telescope that is operating now at higher frequencies, 5 gigahertz, and the wavelengths, short wavelengths involved, you need something that is fairly stiff so it doesn't move around, so the beam is not wandering around on the sky. Stiff is not cool when it comes to earthquakes. August of 2020, one of the support cables, the new support cables, pulled out of the socket at the top of Tower 4 and fell down on the reflector, damaging the reflector. That's a really serious matter. I mean, you got the factor of safety on this telescope was not all that high in the original telescope, and it wasn't any higher after the upgrading. Notice those cables were series. I think 160 wires that were wrapped, individual wires that were wrapped into a major cable. And at one point they were breaking one of those wires per day, which is really, I mean, talk about a red flag. That is a serious matter. On November 2020, one of the main support cables broke. And it was then deemed an engineer's recommendation that telescope had become too dangerous to try to repair. You're not going to want to get anywhere near something like that. And then in December, you see the very tops of two towers falling off there. It was drone that happened to be on the top of Tower 4 at the time, because I think they heard a wire pop.
Yeah. Whoops.
There were more than just one wire that popped there. So that was the end of the Arecibo telescope. There was some talk about rebuilding the telescope, but that was honestly just not on the cards. Interesting, there was one other radio telescope that had collapsed. It was at Green Bank, West Virginia, a 300-footer, spontaneously just collapsed. West Virginia had a senator at the time called Richard Byrd, who was a power in the Senate, and he managed to get money to build another telescope there. Puerto Rico does not have a senator.
Question, you also had ionospheric research facilities, not at the telescope, is that right?
That's right.
Are those continued to be funded?
No,
No.
they were sort of ancillary to what was happening at the telescope itself. So they were making other sorts of measurements.
How does that compare to those big arrays in South America on the mountaintops?
South America?
Yeah. That's why you had all these arrays on
Chile.
tracks.
And Atacama, yeah. There is a whole array of optical or millimeter wave instruments on the Atacama Desert in Chile. It's high, it's dry, it's a perfect place. The atmosphere is as transparent as you're gonna get it from the surface of the earth. They do different things. And this Arecibo was in the radio wavelengths, 5 gigahertz and below. They are in multi-gigabit gigahertz ranges.
Are there
So,
any facilities anywhere in the world at this point in time that are doing the same types of things that Arecibo did?
I'm sorry?
Are there any facilities elsewhere in the world right now that are doing the same sorts of things that Arecibo did?
There are other radio telescopes around, yes. They're of different character. They do different things. They're all studying the same sort of objects, so they're active radio astronomy instruments. The Chinese had built a replica or a copy of Arecibo that's, I think it's 1,500 feet in diameter rather than 1,000 feet diameter. I don't know what science is coming out of there yet, or even if it's working. I just haven't followed that. And I think it's unlikely that big fill dishes like Arecibo will be built again because you can simulate a big, physically big antenna by having lots of little antennas with a total collecting area that's the same as a big antenna, but now they're spread over a big area. So you get the resolving power of an antenna that's that physically big. That requires some fairly hefty signal processing in order to make all that work. On the other hand, the cost of signal processing has gone down so much that now is more effective to build telescopes that way. It's referred to as replacing steel with silicon. So my friend Angel, who may or may not still be with us here on Zoom, took these pictures last spring. This is what the place looked like. Towers are still there, parts of the antenna are still there. I think all of the steel suspended structure has probably been taken away. This may be our Stonehenge. Maybe 10,000 years from now, people will excavate this and wonder what the heck was this? Because I suspect those concrete columns will still be there. So what to do now? Now, while the observatory was in action, with the help of Cornell Development Group, we got donation from Andrew Ramos Foundation to build a science and visitor center at the base of, this is Tower 12. Most of which is still standing, I believe. And this is really quite a nice building. So the NSF decided to do something with this building. And they have put together what's called the NSF Arecibo C3. There's the mouthful of what it's all about. Supposed to open in November of last year. I don't know whether it has or not. And the partners in this are these four partners down here.
Hal, University of Sacred Heart has retired from this consortium.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Agent. That was Angel Vasquez's voice from Puerto Rico. Speaking of sort of the managers, Cornell managed the facility for about 50 years. Cornell faculty basically came up with the idea and created it, built it, and managed it with the support from National Science Foundation and NASA for about 50 years. Sort of astropolitics being what it was, for a number of years, NSF really wanted to find another credible organization to manage Arecibo and not have Cornell run the facility. They did find that, I think, in SRI International with a couple of partners. So I had the distinction of being a co-writer of the first Cornell proposal. It was rejected by the National Science Foundation, and the contract was then given to SRI International, who managed it for another probably 4 years. And then there was yet another group, Colegio Metropolitan, I think, from Santa Monica, that managed it up until the collapse. I'm pleased to say that Cornell had nothing to do with the last decade or so of Arecibo. So I prefer to remember Arecibo looking like that, or like that, which was the first day that I saw it in 1967, coming up as a graduate student. Down here as my Volkswagen Bug. I had as a student, and there in the distance was the Arecibo Observatory, was going to play a major role in my PhD work and in my career at Cornell I was at Cornell for almost 40 years. Not all of it on Arecibo, but sure a lot of it. So with that, let me shut up.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Any questions or comments?
Do you have anything to do with the facility that's over here on radio? What is all the little towers and everything over here by Genome Road?
No.
That's Cornell had. What was that for? That was.
There was an infrared telescope up there. It was run by Jim Houck from the astronomy department, and he was a colleague, but I didn't have anything to do with that.
Al was.
Another guy who was heavily involved.
Okay.
Another guy who was heavily involved was Sam Peter, who ran a small electronics shop here out on, well, it wasn't South Danby for a while. Merlin and I built a spherical reflector out there and put a radome over it, inflated radome over it, which turned out to be a prime target for hunters.
Was
George
that
Peter
down-
passed away. George Peter's brother, Sam Peter, still sells mattresses and furniture around.
Yeah.
96 feet.
Kevin has a question for you.
Kevin,
Yeah, I was curious. I remember seeing some sort of dish down, I think it was off Fisher Settlement Road down in Danby back in the late 70s, early 80s. Was that the one you were referring to?
yeah, that may be the one. I
Okay.
don't think there are too many dishes down that area.
Yeah, I think it was a 100-foot dish, is what I was told. And as I saw it through the years, they were disassembling it and eventually it was gone.
Yeah, I think that's right. It is disassembled.
I visited several times. I was working with George Peter on a project there. Sarah has a question there on the screen. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering what your favorite part about working at Arecibo was.
My favorite part, I think, was working with local people who were really generous, kind, fun-loving, smart, good workers. They all had a great sense of humor, I will say. There were about 125 to 150 people, plus or minus, when I was a director down there. Almost all of them were local Puerto Ricans. There were a few, the scientists were from the States or somewhere else, most of them anyway. And some of the computer folks were continentals, but basically everyone else there was local Puerto Rican.
I'm interested to know if Angel has any good stories to tell us about Hal.
How you doing, guys? First, I want to thank everyone. Thank you, and obviously Hal for inviting me, and I really appreciate it. And Bill also, I got an email from Bill later on mentioning at the meeting. So Thank you, first of all. And I was very fortunate that, well, Hal was my first boss. Okay, I arrived at when I arrived at the observatory. He was the director when I arrived, and so I've known Hal for over 40 something years. I arrived at the observatory. I was there for about 46 years, and Hal was numero uno. Let me tell you, as a director, Hal was the coolest director ever. And I remember him coming in with his MG, coming in and going through the control room. And so he was just like the typical guy. He was the typical guy everybody wanted to be. But so Hal was a very, 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 very nice guy. So he said that the people at the observatory, he was absolutely right. The people at the observatory back then, when it was under Cornell management, it was the place to be. I was very, very, very fortunate to have worked there 46 years, and uh, at being a ham, it was fantastic. Also being a ham, working at the observatory. I mean, I get to play the same thing I play at home and play at the job. Although when Hal was working there, I didn't know he was a ham. So, but as he said, we did the moon bounce. We were very fortunate to do the moon bounce project, which made cover QST and stuff. So for being a ham, that was kind of stuff. It was just a great place to work, and I appreciate Hal's friendship for us for so many years, and still in contact with somebody as exclusive as Dr. Hal Kraft. And so I appreciate everyone for letting me joining your exclusive club as well. Thanks, guys.
So I should say that the folks who worked down there when Cornell was operating were Cornell employees. Indistinguishable from the Cornell employee on campus there. They had the same benefits that Cornell employee had here. I think, I can't really speak for them, but I think they took pride in working for a serious university. And they got, not incidentally, a pretty generous retirement program. And they also got the Cornell Children's Tuition Scholarship Program, which if they were old enough, like me, they got full tuition at Cornell. That's not to say education was free at Cornell, but there was a big chunk that came out.
Cornell was number one there, Hal. I remember, and I was also one of the fortunate ones to be a Cornell retiree as well. So yes, still have the medical plan for Cornell, and I've got the Cornell.edu email for life, which is kind of nice as well. And you're absolutely right. During the time we went through a couple of consortiums after Cornell. It never worked the same. I was never a fan of the consortiums because I had to supervise people for different under different management. That never worked out. But SRI went in, and then the last one, by the way, Hal, was UCF, University of Central Florida, was the one head of that last consortium, and that's when the telescope unfortunately collapsed. So, but under Cornell, it was the best. It was the best time to work at the observatory. And absolutely, I gotta echo your sentiments on that one, Hal. Cornell University up in Ithaca, and I was fortunate to visit Ithaca also up there a few times, and that was the number one. That was the best times.
Thank you, Angel.
Hell, do you remember a guy by the name of Gentner that used to work down
Bill
there?
Gentner.
Willie? Yeah.
Bill.
I know.
He actually was the VE guy that tested me when I got my license for being a hand.
This small town, you know.
Yeah. Good friend. Good friend.
Yeah, Bill Genter, KP30,
Yeah. Yeah, it used to be
NK2V.
NK2B used to be. Yeah, he changed his call sign. Of course, he changed his wife and a few other things too, connected with that operation down there, but that's okay.
I don't know if anybody saw it in the chat, but Sarah posted a QSL card that Angel had sent to W2CXM.
Oh, yeah. I guess that's the one. I think the Arecibo Observatory telescope is on the other side of that.
Well, Well, Hal, thank you so much for making the time and to present this to us. It was really enjoyable for me.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
And Daniel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys. Good job, Hal.